October 13th, 1943. 21,000 feet above the Low Countries, Second Lieutenant Robert Halloway pressed his forehead against the freezing plexiglas of the astrodome and tried to ignore the sweat freezing beneath his leather helmet. Through the transparent bubble mounted atop his B-17 flying fortress, he could see Polaris burning with impossible brightness in the crystalline darkness. Beautiful, precise, completely wrong for what he'd just calculated. The numbers on his navigation chart made no sense. According to his celestial fix using 3 separate stars, the squadron was 15 miles south of their planned route to Schweinfurt. 15 miles. The kind of error that got navigators grounded, that got crews killed, that turned precision bombing raids into random death scattered across the German countryside. His hands shook as he double-checked the HO 249 tables for the 3rd time. The Air Almanac pages were dog-eared from constant use during the 6-hour navigation course at Selman Field. But Halloway had never made an error this catastrophic during training. Never been this far off course with 291 other bombers depending on his squadron to hold formation. Captain James Richardson's voice crackled through the intercom from the pilot's seat 15 feet forward. "Nav, give me a position check. We should be crossing the IP in 20 minutes. The initial point, the landmark where they'd turn onto the bomb run, flying straight and level for 6 agonizing minutes while German anti-aircraft batteries zeroed in with mathematical precision." Halloway's throat constricted. According to his calculations, they weren't anywhere near the planned IP. They were drifting south, pulling the entire 3rd element of the formation with them. "Working on it, Skipper," Halloway replied, forcing steadiness into his voice. Took another celestial fix. Still refining the position. What he didn't say was that his astro navigation had just told him they were headed directly toward a completely different section of Germany. Away from Schweinfurt, away from the carefully briefed route that intelligence officers had spent weeks planning to thread between known Flak concentrations. Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, the flight engineer, leaned down from his station behind the pilots. "Kid, you okay back there? Your voice sounds funny." Morrison had flown 23 missions. He had seen navigators crack under pressure, watched green officers freeze when the flak started bursting and the fighters came screaming through the formation with cannons blazing. Halloway was on his 4th mission, still green enough to second-guess himself when the numbers didn't match expectations. "I'm fine," Halloway lied. He stared at his dead reckoning plot, the pencil line tracing their course from the assembly point over East Anglia. Then he looked at his celestial fix. The 2 positions disagreed by 15 miles. 15 miles, that could mean the difference between life and death. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The aviation historian Stephen Ambrose would later document in his comprehensive study of the 8th Air Force that navigational errors during deep penetration raids were terrifyingly common. Dead reckoning using forecast winds could produce errors of 10 to 20 miles over a 5-hour mission. Celestial navigation, when conditions permitted, offered the only reliable way to verify position. But celestial navigation required clear skies, accurate sextant readings, precise timing, and mathematics performed under combat stress by men barely old enough to vote. Halloway pulled out his octant again, the military version of a sextant designed for aviation use. Through the astrodome's curved plexiglas, he sighted on Vega, timing the observation with his A11 chronometer. The watch's second hand swept around the dial with mechanical indifference to his mounting panic. He noted the angle, consulted his tables, and plotted the line of position on his chart. The line confirmed his previous fix. They were south, of course, significantly south. He could report the error, tell Captain Richardson they needed to correct northward immediately. The captain would follow his guidance, the squadron would adjust course, and they'd rejoin the main formation somewhere over Germany. Standard procedure, textbook navigation. except that correcting course meant cutting diagonally across central Germany, potentially flying through flak zones that intelligence hadn't briefed, and it meant admitting to Richardson, to Morrison, to the entire crew, that he'd screwed up the navigation on only his fourth mission, that he couldn't be trusted with the basic responsibility of keeping them on course. Halloway's training at the Army Air Force's navigation school had been 8 months of intensive instruction. Hours under the astrodome of the Lynx Celestial Navigation Trainer, that 45-foot-high building at Hondo Field where instructors projected artificial stars onto a dome and scored student navigators on their ability to calculate position. Classroom work on wind drift, dead reckoning, radio navigation, every technique needed to find targets hundreds of miles inside enemy territory, but no training simulator could replicate the reality of combat navigation. The way the bomber bucked in turbulence, while you tried to hold the octant steady, the fear that made your hands shake when distant flak bursts walked across the sky toward your formation, the knowledge that 9 other men in this aircraft and 30 men in the 3 planes following your squadron lead were betting their lives on your mathematics. Nav, Richardson here. Need that position now. Halloway closed his eyes. He could hear his navigation instructor, Captain Thurlow's voice during the final exam. Gentlemen, there will come a moment when you're not sure, when the numbers don't make sense, and your gut tells you something's wrong. In that moment, you have 2 choices. Trust your training or trust your instincts. Choose wisely. He opened his eyes and looked at the chart again. The pencil marks showed their planned route, taking them directly over a cluster of red cross-hatched areas. According to the intelligence briefing that morning, those marks indicated the locations of heavy flak batteries defending the approaches to Schweinfurt. 88mm guns that could fire 20 shells per minute to altitudes of 30,000 feet, each shell exploding in a black burst of steel fragments that could shred aluminum skin, sever control cables, and kill men in an instant. The official 8th Air Force records maintained at the Air Force Historical Research Agency would later show that Flak accounted for nearly half of all bomber losses during the strategic campaign against Germany. By October 1943, the Luftwaffe had positioned more than 15,000 anti-aircraft guns throughout Germany and occupied territories. The defenses around critical industrial targets, like Schweinfurt, were particularly dense, with multiple batteries positioned to create overlapping fields of fire that no bomber formation could avoid. Halloway's errant course would take them south of those batteries, south of the planned route, south of the carefully briefed navigation points that intelligence had selected specifically because they offered the safest approach to the target. But safely meant relatively. Nothing about flying 21,000 feet over Germany in broad daylight was safe. He made his decision. Captain, I've got our position. Halloway kept his voice level, professional. We're right on course. Estimate initial point in 19 minutes. The lie burned in his throat, like swallowed gasoline. He was telling his pilot they were on course when they were actually 15 miles south. He was confirming a position he knew was wrong. He was violating every principle of navigation he'd been taught. But something in his gut told him not to correct northward. Some instinct born of staring at that intelligence map during the morning briefing, seeing those red cross-hatched areas, imagining what it would be like to fly through that steel storm. Roger. Nav. 19-18 minutes to IP. Richardson's voice carried the calm confidence that had made him one of the most respected pilots in the 391st Bomb Group. All crew, this is pilot. Estimate initial point in 19 minutes. Bombardier, start your pre-bomb run checklist. Second Lieutenant Thomas Brennan, the bombardier lying in the plexiglass nose 15 feet below the cockpit, acknowledged the call. He'd be the one lining up the Norden bomb site, calculating the final bombing solution, while Richardson held the aircraft steady through the flak. 6 minutes of straight and level flight during which evasive action was impossible, during which every German gunner in a 20-mile radius would be aiming for their formation. Halloway felt the weight of what he'd just done settle onto his shoulders like a flak vest made of lead and guilt. He'd lied to his pilot. He'd deliberately steered the squadron off course. If they missed the target, if the bombs fell uselessly into German farmland, if the mission failed because of his navigation error, he'd be court-martialed, grounded, sent home in disgrace while better men continued fighting the war. Sergeant Billy Carpenter, the ball turret gunner, called out over the intercom. "Skipper, I'm seeing some contrails at our 10 o'clock low. Looks like the main formation ahead of us." Halloway's stomach twisted. The main formation was where they were supposed to be, north of their actual position, following the carefully planned route. Flying toward the initial point that intelligence had selected, flying toward those red cross-hatched areas on his chart. "Roger. Ball, keep tracking them." Richardson paused, then added, "Nav, are you sure about our position? Looks like we might be tracking south of the mainstream." This was it. The moment when Halloway could confess his error, correct course, rejoin the formation, do the right thing. "I'm sure, sir." The lie came easier the second time. "We're on course. The main formation might have drifted north." It wasn't impossible. Wind shifts could push formations off their planned routes. But Halloway knew that wasn't what was happening. The main formation was on course. His squadron wasn't. The minutes crawled past with agonizing slowness. Through the astrodome, Halloway could see the condensation trails of other bomber formations, white streaks against the dark blue sky. They were flying alone now, separated from the main bomber stream by 15 miles of German airspace. Morrison called down from the flight engineer's station. "Skipper, we're burning more fuel than planned. Must be bucking headwinds." "Roger, engineer, monitor consumption and give me an update in 10 minutes. Halloway realized another consequence of his navigation error. By flying south of the planned route, they were encountering different wind conditions than forecast. The fuel calculations had been based on the briefed winds along the briefed route. Every deviation from the plan cascaded into new problems, new risks, new ways for this mission to turn catastrophic. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Brien, the radio operator stationed behind Halloway's navigation table, leaned over and tapped his shoulder. "Lieutenant, you seeing what I'm seeing out there?" Halloway looked up. Through the astrodome, he could see the contrails of the main bomber formation curving northeast toward Schweinfurt. And ahead of those contrails, barely visible at this distance, tiny black puffs appeared in the sky, like lethal flowers blooming at 20,000 feet. Flak, the German anti-aircraft batteries, had opened fire on the main formation. From 15 miles away, the explosions looked small, almost insignificant, but Halloway knew each burst represented an 88mm shell exploding with enough force to tear through aluminum, steel, and human flesh. "Jesus Christ," O'Brien whispered. "They're getting hammered." Through the intercom, they could hear snippets of radio traffic from the main formation, calls of Flak at 12 o'clock level and number 3 engine hit and navigators down, and other fragments of communication from men fighting for their lives in the steel storm. The red cross-hatched areas on Halloway's chart had represented real German gun batteries with real shells and real death, and the main formation was flying directly through them, because that was the briefed route, the carefully planned approach that intelligence had selected as the best path to the target. Halloway stared at the chart with mounting horror as he began to understand what his navigation error had done. By flying 15 miles south, by lying about their position, by keeping the squadron on an incorrect course, he'd steered them away from the worst of the German flak defenses. His mistake was saving their lives. "Nav, Richardson here." The captain's voice was tight. "Are you absolutely certain of our position?" Halloway looked at his celestial fix, looked at the dead reckoning plot, looked at the distant black flowers blooming where the main formation was being torn apart by German guns, made his third lie. "Affirmative, Skipper." "Affirmative, Skipper. We're on course." They flew onward through empty sky, while 15 miles north, men were dying. The historical record maintained by the United States Air Forces in Europe would later document that October the 13th, 1943, saw one of the most intense flak barrages of the entire war. German batteries defending the approaches to Schweinfurt fired more than 3,000 shells during the raid, creating a literal wall of steel fragments that bomber formations had to penetrate. But that was happening to the north. In the sky where Halloway's squadron was flying, there was only clear air and the distant contrails of other bombers and the steadily growing knot of dread in his stomach. Pilot to crew, we're coming up on the IP. All gunners, stay alert. Bombardier, you've got the aircraft. Bombardier has the aircraft, Brennan confirmed from the nose. Through the Norden bomb site, he'd be watching the target approach, making fine adjustments to guide Richardson through the bomb run. Except they weren't approaching the correct target. They were 15 miles south of Schweinfurt, flying toward... Halloway checked his chart again, trying to figure out where they actually were. His navigation error had been so focused on avoiding the immediate threat of flak that he hadn't calculated where their errant course was actually taking them. His blood froze as realization hit. They were approaching Würzburg, not Schweinfurt. Würzburg, a city 60 miles south of their assigned target, a city that, according to his chart, had its own defensive flak batteries, maybe not as many as Schweinfurt, but enough to kill them all. Bombardier pilot, do you have the target in sight? Brennan's response came after a long pause. Negative, skipper. I'm not seeing the Kugelfischer plant. This doesn't look right. Richardson's voice sharpened. Nav, what's our position? The moment of truth had arrived. Halloway could continue lying, could steer them toward Würzburg and hope for the best, or he could confess his navigation error, admit he'd deliberately taken them off course, and face the consequences. Before he could answer, Morrison shouted from the flight engineer's station. Flak, at 12 o'clock level. Black bursts blossomed ahead of them, appearing with terrifying suddenness. Not the massive barrage hitting the main formation to the north, but enough to kill. German gunners had spotted their formation, had calculated range and altitude, had begun firing. Evasive action. Richardson yanked the control yoke, throwing the 30-ton bomber into a banking turn that made the airframe groan. The three aircraft following in their element stayed glued to their wing, pilots fighting to maintain formation while dodging the steel fragments screaming through the air around them. Halloway grabbed the edge of his navigation table as the aircraft bucked and twisted. His charts scattered across the floor, his octant bounced against the astrodome with a sickening crack. Everything he'd calculated, every lie he'd told, every decision he'd made, suddenly meant nothing in the face of immediate survival. Flak above us, Carpenter called from the ball turret. They've got our altitude. More black bursts appeared. Closer now. Close enough that Halloway could hear the explosions over the roar of the four Wright Cyclone engines, close enough that shrapnel pinged against the fuselage like deadly hail. Richardson rolled the aircraft hard right, then left, then dove 2,000 feet, while Brennan cursed steadily from the bombardier's position. The bomb load made the B-17 handle like a pregnant whale, but Richardson flew with the skill that had brought him through 22 previous missions alive. Coming through the barrage now, Morrison reported. I count at least 40 gun positions down there. Maybe more. 40 gun positions that would have been added to the 80 positioned around Schweinfurt if Halloway had corrected course. 40 gun batteries that the main formation wasn't encountering because they were 15 miles north, but which would have slaughtered Halloway's squadron if they'd tried to fly through Schweinfurt's defenses. The aircraft shuddered as shrapnel tore through the left wing. O'Brien called out damage reports. Port wing hit, icy fuel streaming. How bad? Richardson demanded. Not too bad. Looks like we're losing about 50 gallons. Should make it home okay if it doesn't get worse. They burst through the flak zone into clear air beyond. Richardson leveled the aircraft and checked in with the other three planes in their element. All four had survived. Battered, but flying. Nav, I need to know exactly where we are. Right now. Halloway scrambled to pick up his scattered charts. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his pencil. They'd just flown through a flak barrage that could have killed them all because of his navigation error. They'd missed their assigned target completely. They were lost over Germany with a fuel leak and no idea where they'd ended up. And somehow, impossibly, they were still alive when much of the main formation was being torn apart to the north. He found his chart, found his last celestial fix, found the calculations he'd made, did the math again with trembling fingers, checked the landmarks visible through the astrodome against his position. Skipper, we're approximately 12 miles southeast of our assigned target. That flak barrage we just flew through, according to my chart, those were the Würzburg defenses. We drifted south of the primary. How far south? Richardson's voice was dangerously quiet. 15 miles, sir. Silence filled the intercom. Every man on the crew was doing the same math Halloway had done, calculating what 15 miles meant, understanding that their navigator had taken them completely off course. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Brennan spoke first from the bombardier's position. Lieutenant, 15 miles south. That means we avoided the main flak concentrations defending Schweinfurt, Morrison finished. The batteries that are tearing the main formation apart right now. They could all hear it in the radio traffic still crackling through O'Brien's station. Damage reports from the lead formations, aircraft going down, pilots calling out wounded crew members, the organized chaos of men fighting through the steel storm that intelligence had known would be waiting, the steel storm that Halloway's navigation error had steered them around. Richardson's voice came back, controlled but intense. Nav, did you know we were off course? This was the moment. The confession that would end his career, the truth that might save his life or might get him court-martialed. Halloway had one chance to explain what he'd done and why. Yes, sir. I knew. The words came out barely above a whisper. My celestial fix showed us 15 miles south of our planned route. I should have corrected course. Instead, I told you we were on course because... How did you explain a feeling, an instinct? A decision made because something in his gut had screamed at him, not to fly toward those red, cross-hatched areas on the chart. Because I was scared, Halloway continued. I saw the flak positions briefed for the planned route, and I was scared of flying through them, so I didn't correct our course. I lied to you, sir. I kept us off course deliberately. The intercom was silent for a long moment. Then Morrison spoke, his voice carrying an emotion Halloway couldn't quite identify. Kid, you saved our lives. He's right, Carpenter added from the ball turret. You see what's happening to the guys who stayed on the briefed route? They're getting murdered up there. That doesn't excuse lying to the pilot, Richardson said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Lieutenant Halloway, you deliberately took us off course and failed to report a navigation error. That's a court-martial offense. I know, sir. But you also demonstrated tactical judgment that probably kept us from getting shot down. Those flak positions around Schweinfurt. Jesus Christ, Nav. We would have flown straight into the worst of it. They continued south, away from Schweinfurt, away from the battle, away from their assigned target. Richardson got on the radio and raised the group commander, explaining their position. After a tense conversation, they received new orders. Proceed to the secondary target at Würzburg and make their bomb run there, which meant flying back toward those flak batteries they'd just escaped. You heard the man, Richardson announced to the crew. We're going back around for a bomb run on Würzburg. It's not the primary, but at least we'll put our bombs on something useful. Halloway watched through the astrodome as Richardson brought the aircraft around in a wide turn, the other three planes in their element following. They'd have to make another pass through those German guns, this time flying straight and level while Brennan lined up his bomb sight. But this time, they'd be prepared. This time, the German gunners wouldn't have the advantage of surprise, and this time, Halloway would give Richardson accurate navigation, would do his job the way he'd been trained, would be the navigator he was supposed to be, even if it meant flying back into the fire. The Würzburg flak batteries opened up as they approached from the south. Black bursts appeared ahead of them like deadly flowers blooming in precise geometric patterns. German gunners who'd tracked them through their first pass now had their range, their altitude, their speed calculated. Steady, Brennan called from the bombardier's position. I've got visual on the target, railway yards and factory complex. Bomb bay doors coming open. The aircraft shuddered as the doors opened, adding drag and making them more vulnerable. Richardson held the bomber absolutely level, while Brennan made his final calculations through the Norden bomb sight. Flak burst around them in rippling patterns. Shrapnel screamed through the air. Something hit their number 3 engine with a metallic clang that made Halloway's heart stop. Morrison cursed steadily from the flight engineer's position. Number 3's smoking, Morrison reported. Oil pressure falling. We might need to feather it. Not yet, Richardson replied. Not until we're off the bomb run. They flew onward through the steel storm. 30 seconds. 20, 10. Bombs away, Brennan announced. The B-17 lurched upward as 2 tons of high explosive departed the bomb bay. Richardson immediately began evasive action, banking hard right and diving away from the flak zone while Morrison worked to feather the damaged number 3 engine. "All aircraft, this is lead," Richardson called over the radio. "Rally on me, we're heading home." The 4 aircraft of their element pulled together into a defensive formation and turned west toward England. Behind them, black smoke rose from the Würzburg railway yards where their bombs had struck, not the assigned target, not the precision strike on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants that intelligence had planned, but something, some contribution to the war effort beyond just surviving another mission. The flight home took 3 hours through skies that felt empty despite being filled with hundreds of returning bombers. Richardson nursed their damaged aircraft westward, the 3 remaining engines straining to maintain altitude. Morrison had successfully feathered number 3, the propeller blades turned edge-on to reduce drag, but they'd lost 20% of their power and were burning fuel faster than planned. "Nav, give me a course direct to base," Richardson ordered. "No scenic routes. We need to get this bird on the ground before we run dry." Halloway plotted the most direct line from their current position to Framlingham, the base in Suffolk where the 391st Bomb Group operated from. No mistakes this time. No deliberate errors. Just precise navigation calculated with shaking hands and a mind that kept replaying the decision he'd made over Germany. They crossed the English Channel at 14,000 feet, lower than they'd departed, heavy with fuel consumption and battle damage. The white cliffs of Dover appeared through broken cloud cover, like a promise of salvation. Every man in the crew felt the tension ease slightly as they left German airspace behind. But the radio traffic told a different story. O'Brien monitored the frequencies, listening to damage reports from other crews, aircraft calling out emergency landings, bombers that had taken catastrophic damage and were barely making it home. The October 13th mission was turning into a massacre. "Skipper, I'm hearing a lot of aircraft in trouble," O'Brien reported quietly. "Sounds like the formations that hit Schweinfurt got torn up pretty bad." Richardson's response was terse. "Focus on our bird radio. Let other crews worry about themselves." But they all knew what it meant. The main formations had flown the briefed route, had approached Schweinfurt exactly as intelligence had planned, had followed doctrine and procedure, and everything the mission planners had determined was the correct approach, and they'd been slaughtered for it. Halloway stared at his navigation chart, at the red cross-hatched areas marking known flak positions, at the pencil line showing where he'd actually taken the squadron. 15 miles. The distance between following orders and following instinct, the distance between precision planning and desperate improvisation, the distance between death and survival. They landed at Framlingham just after 1400 hours, the damaged B-17 touching down hard on the concrete runway, with Morrison calling out their remaining fuel. 200 gallons, barely enough for 20 minutes of flight time. Ground crews swarmed the aircraft as Richardson shut down the engines, assessing damage, counting holes, shaking their heads at how close they'd come to not making it home. Halloway climbed out of the aircraft and stood on the tarmac, his legs shaking from 3 hours of adrenaline and fear. Around him, other crews were disembarking, some carrying wounded, some standing in silent shock, all sharing the 1,000-yard stare of men who'd just survived something they shouldn't have. But many aircraft were missing. Empty dispersal areas marked spaces where bombers should have returned, but didn't. Halloway counted the empty spaces and felt sick. The 391st had sent 22 aircraft on the mission. Only 17 had returned so far. 5 missing, 50 men. "Lieutenant Halloway." A staff car had pulled up and a major from group operations was stepping out. "Colonel wants to see you immediately. Bring your navigation log and all charts from today's mission." This was it. The reckoning. Halloway gathered his materials with numb fingers and followed the major to the operations building. Other crews were being debriefed. Intelligence officers asking questions about enemy fighter tactics, flak positions, bombing accuracy, the organized chaos of post-mission analysis. But Halloway was taken to a separate room where Colonel Julius Lacey sat behind a desk, his face carved from stone. Richardson was already there, standing at attention. Behind the colonel stood a major from 8th Air Force headquarters and a captain from the Judge Advocate General's office. This wasn't a debriefing. This was an investigation. "Lieutenant Halloway, have a seat." Lacey's voice was neutral, professionally cold. "Captain Richardson has filed a report stating that you deliberately navigated his aircraft off the briefed route. Is this accurate?" "Yes, sir." He further states that you lied about your position when asked for position checks. Confirmed. Yes, sir. Do you understand the gravity of these actions, Lieutenant? We're talking about deliberately disobeying mission orders, falsifying navigation reports, and endangering your crew by taking them off the planned route. Halloway met the Colonel's eyes. I understand, sir. I made a navigational error that took us 15 miles south of the planned route. When I realized the error, I chose not to correct course because... He paused, trying to find words that wouldn't sound like excuses. Because my instinct told me the briefed route was wrong. The JAG captain leaned forward. Your instinct, Lieutenant. You're a commissioned officer in the United States Army Air Forces with 8 months of navigation training. We don't operate on instinct. We operate on procedure, planning, and orders. Yes, sir. I know that. Then explain to me, the Colonel said, why I shouldn't court-martial you right now for deliberate disobedience of mission orders. Before Halloway could answer, Richardson spoke up. Sir, if I may. Lieutenant Halloway's navigation error took us away from the main Flak concentrations defending Schweinfurt. The formations that flew the briefed route encountered the heaviest anti-aircraft fire I've seen in 23 missions. Based on the radio traffic we monitored, casualties in those formations were severe. That doesn't excuse his actions, Captain. No, sir, it doesn't. But it explains the result. Lieutenant Halloway made an unauthorized tactical decision that probably saved his crew and 3 other aircraft. The Major from 8th Air Force Headquarters spoke for the first time. Gentlemen, I've been reviewing the preliminary reports from today's mission. The formations that attacked Schweinfurt encountered coordinated flak from approximately 80 anti-aircraft batteries positioned around the city. Early estimates suggest we lost 60 aircraft over the target area, 60 B-17s, 600 men. The number hit like a physical blow. 60 aircraft, 20% of the attacking force. The worst single-day losses the 8th Air Force had suffered in the entire war. Captain Richardson's squadron avoided those losses by flying south of the planned route. The Major continued, which raises an interesting question about our mission planning methodology. How did intelligence miss the fact that the northern approach to Schweinfurt was so heavily defended? Lacey's expression shifted slightly. We knew there would be heavy flak around the target. That's why we planned the approach the way we did, to minimize exposure time. Colonel, with respect, you planned the approach directly through the densest flak belt in central Germany. Lieutenant Halloway's accidental course deviation took his squadron around it. I'd call that excellent tactical judgment, even if it wasn't executed through proper channels. It was still deliberate disobedience. Yes, sir. And if he'd followed orders, his crew would probably be dead, right now. The room fell silent. Halloway sat frozen, watching senior officers debate his fate while the implications of the day's mission spread like ink through water. 60 aircraft lost. The mission planners had sent men into a death trap, following procedures and planning methodology that looked perfect on paper, but fell apart in the face of German defenses. His navigation error had saved 4 crews by accident. But what about all the others who'd followed orders and died for it? The JAG captain consulted his notes. Lieutenant, let me ask you directly. Did you know you were off course when you made your first position report to Captain Richardson? Yes, sir. And you chose not to correct course because you believed the briefed route was dangerous? I didn't think it through that clearly at the time, sir. I saw the flak positions marked on the intelligence chart, and I saw that my navigation error had taken us south of those positions, and something in my gut told me not to correct course. It wasn't a reasoned tactical decision. It was fear. Fear that saved lives, Richardson interjected. Or luck, the JAG captain countered. If the German defenses had been positioned differently, his navigation error could have taken them into worse danger. The fact that it worked out doesn't necessarily vindicate the decision. The debate continued for another 20 minutes, while Halloway sat in silence. He'd done what he'd done. He'd lied to his pilot, he'd deviated from the mission plan, he'd followed instinct over procedure. Whether that made him a hero or a coward wasn't for him to decide. Finally, Colonel Lacey held up his hand. Gentlemen, this is my decision. Lieutenant Halloway, you are hereby officially reprimanded for failing to report a navigation error and for providing false position information to your pilot. This reprimand will be entered in your service record. Halloway's heart sank. A reprimand could end his career, prevent promotions, mark him permanently as unreliable. However, Lacey continued, given the extenuating circumstances and the fact that your actions likely prevented significant casualties, I'm not pursuing court-martial charges. You'll continue flying missions with Captain Richardson's crew, and you'll be under close observation for the next month. Any further navigation errors will result in immediate removal from flight status. Understood? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Lieutenant. We need navigators too badly to waste them on courts-martial, but if you ever lie to your pilot again, I'll ground you permanently. Dismissed. Halloway and Richardson saluted and left the operations building. Outside, the autumn air felt impossibly fresh after the stale tension of the interrogation room. Other crews were walking toward the mess hall, talking in low voices about the mission, about the friends who hadn't come back. Richardson lit a cigarette and offered one to Halloway, who declined. They stood in silence for a moment, watching mechanics work on damaged aircraft across the hardstand. You scared the hell out of me today, Lieutenant, Richardson said finally, when I realized you'd taken us. Of course, deliberately, I thought about all the ways it could have gone wrong. We could have missed the target completely, could have run out of fuel, could have flown into worse defenses. I know, sir. I'm sorry. But we didn't. We survived when a lot of good men didn't. And that's worth something. Richardson took a long drag on his cigarette. I've been flying bombers for 2 years, Lieutenant. I've seen a lot of navigators. Some brilliant, some competent, some who couldn't find their ass with both hands and a map. You did something today that none of them would have done. You trusted your gut over your training, and it saved our lives. It was wrong, sir. I should have reported the error and let you make the decision about correcting course. Maybe. But maybe by the time we'd discussed it and decided what to do, we'd have been committed to the northern route. Sometimes the right decision requires acting before you have time to think it through. He dropped his cigarette and ground it out under his boot. Come on, let's get some food and try to forget this day happened. But forgetting was impossible. Over the next hours, as damaged bombers continued limping home and the casualty figures climbed higher, the scope of the disaster became clear. The October 13th mission to Schweinfurt had been catastrophic. Official 8th Air Force records would eventually document the loss of 60 bombers, with more than 600 crewmen killed, wounded, or captured. It became known as Black Thursday, the darkest day in the history of American strategic bombing. Intelligence officers scrambled to understand what had gone wrong, why the Flak defenses had been so much more effective than predicted. The answer, eventually, was that German commanders had concentrated their anti-aircraft batteries around Schweinfurt specifically because they knew it would be a target again after the first raid in August. The approaches that looked safest on intelligence maps were actually killing zones designed to destroy bomber formations before they reached the target. And the American mission planners had sent 300 aircraft directly into the trap. But Halloway's navigation error had taken his squadron around it. Word spread through the 391st Bomb Group and beyond. The navigator who'd deliberately flown off course and saved 4 crews. Some called him lucky. Some called him smart. Some questioned whether he'd actually made an error at all or whether he'd calculated the deviation deliberately. Halloway knew the truth. He'd been scared, had made a mistake in his celestial navigation that produced an erroneous position, and had compounded that mistake by lying about it because he was too afraid to admit the error and too afraid to fly through the flak zones marked on his chart. Everything that followed had been accident and instinct dressed up as tactical judgment. 3 days later, intelligence officers came to interview him about his route south of Schweinfurt. They wanted to know what he'd seen, what flak positions he'd encountered, whether the southern approach might be viable for future missions. Halloway showed them his charts, explained his navigation error, described the German batteries they'd encountered near Würzburg. The intelligence captain, a West Point graduate named Harwood, studied the charts for a long time. Lieutenant, You realize that if we'd briefed your route as the primary approach, we might have saved 40 or 50 aircraft. Yes, sir. But I didn't brief the route. I stumbled onto it by accident. Accident or not, you demonstrated that our intelligence on German flak positions was incomplete. We thought the northern approach offered the safest angles. We were wrong. Harwood marked several positions on the chart. The Luftwaffe has been shifting their gun batteries to create kill zones, exactly where we expect to attack from. Your southern route avoided those zones because it wasn't expected. Will you use it for future missions? We can't. Now that you've flown it, the Germans know about it. They'll position guns to cover that approach too. That's the problem with strategic bombing, Lieutenant. Every route works exactly once. After that, the enemy adapts. The insight was depressing, but accurate. The air war over Germany was an endless game of adaptation and counter-adaptation, each side trying to predict the other's moves. Each victory creating the conditions for the next defeat. Halloway flew 6 more missions over the next month, each time following the briefed route exactly, reporting his positions accurately, never again allowing instinct to override procedure. Richardson put in for a distinguished flying cross for him, arguing that his actions on October the 13th had demonstrated exceptional airmanship under combat conditions. The recommendation was denied, the official reasoning being that Halloway had violated mission orders, even if the result had been beneficial. But unofficially, the message was clear. The 8th Air Force couldn't reward deliberate disobedience, even successful disobedience. To do so would undermine the entire command structure that kept hundreds of bombers flying in coordinated formations toward assigned targets. December brought a reprieve from deep penetration missions. The winter weather over Germany made large-scale operations impossible, and crew replacements began arriving to fill the gaps left by Black Thursday and subsequent raids. New navigators, fresh from training, eager and terrified, asking the veterans for advice on how to survive. Halloway found himself teaching classes on celestial navigation, showing new navigators how to use the octant through the astrodome, how to calculate position from star sights, how to verify their dead reckoning with actual observations. He emphasized accuracy, precision, the importance of reporting errors immediately. But privately, alone in his quarters, late at night, he wondered whether any of that training mattered, because the truth he'd learned on October 13th was that sometimes survival required more than accurate navigation. Sometimes it required trusting instinct over orders, making decisions that looked wrong on paper but felt right in your gut. And sometimes it required being lucky enough to make the right mistake at the right time. By February 1944, the strategic situation had changed. Long-range P-51 Mustang fighters began escorting bomber formations deep into Germany, their drop tanks extending their range to cover the entire mission profile. The fighter escorts dramatically reduced bomber losses, making deep penetration raids survivable again. The lessons of Black Thursday had been learned at terrible cost. Better fighter coverage, improved intelligence on German defenses, revised approach routes that accounted for concentrated flak positions. The air campaign continued, but with adaptations born from blood and wreckage. Richardson completed his 25th mission in March and rotated home for a well-earned leave. The rest of the crew, including Halloway, were reassigned to a new pilot, a lieutenant from Oklahoma named Garrett, who flew with mechanical precision and never questioned his navigator's reports. Halloway completed his own tour of 25 missions in April 1944, exactly 1 year after beginning his combat service. He'd flown through flak and fighters, had watched aircraft explode in midair, had seen friends die, and had somehow survived. His navigation had been accurate on 24 of those missions. The 25th, his final mission, took them to Brunswick on a clear spring morning. The formation followed the briefed route exactly, approached the target with textbook precision, dropped their bombs on the assigned aim point, and flew home without major incident. Halloway's navigation was perfect throughout. Every position check accurate, every calculation verified. It was everything the October 13th mission should have been. But he never forgot that his most successful navigation had been his most inaccurate, that his best judgment had been his worst error, that survival sometimes required breaking every rule he'd been taught. The official history of the October 13th mission was written by 8th Air Force historians after the war, analyzing what went wrong, how the Germans had just concentrated their defenses, why American casualties had been so high. The report ran to hundreds of pages, detailing everything from fighter escort failures to bomb damage assessment to recommendations for future operations. Buried in Appendix 14 was a brief mention of navigational deviations observed during the mission. One squadron had reportedly flown south of the planned route and encountered lighter opposition as a result. No explanation was provided for why the deviation occurred. It was treated as an anomaly, a data point. That didn't fit the larger narrative. Robert Halloway's name appeared nowhere in the report. He returned to civilian life in 1945, got a job with Pan American Airways as a commercial navigator on transatlantic routes, got married, had 3 children. He never spoke publicly about his war service, never attended veteran reunions, never tried to claim credit for his actions on October the 13th. Captain Richardson, who'd become Major Richardson by war's end, wrote to him occasionally. In one letter, dated August 1948, Richardson mentioned that he'd tracked down the other pilots from their element on the Schweinfurt mission. All 3 had survived the war. 12 men who'd lived because their navigator had made a mistake and then lied about it. "I've thought a lot about that day," Richardson wrote, "about how close we came to following orders straight into disaster, about how your fear and your error and your deliberate disobedience saved our lives. I still don't know if what you did was right or wrong. Maybe it was both. Maybe that's what war does to people, makes them choose between different kinds of wrong and hope they pick the one that leads to survival." Halloway kept the letter in a drawer for 40 years. After he died, in 1988, his daughter found it along with his navigation logs from the war, his octant wrapped in oiled cloth, his charts with their red cross-hatched areas marking flak positions that had killed so many men. She donated the materials to the mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia, where they sit in climate-controlled storage, preserved but mostly forgotten. Museum visitors come to see the restored B-17s, to hear stories about the heroic bomber crews, to learn about the strategic campaign that helped defeat Nazi Germany. Few ask about the navigators who guided those bombers to their targets. Fewer still understand the impossible decisions those navigators faced, calculating positions with mathematical precision while German shells exploded around them, trying to follow orders while instinct screamed at them to deviate, to improvise, to survive. The lesson Robert Halloway learned on October the 13th, 1943, was never formally acknowledged by the Air Force. No doctrine was changed, no training curriculum updated, no official recognition given to the idea that sometimes tactical judgment required disobeying orders. But the lesson persisted in the oral tradition of navigators who served in World War II, passed down through generations of airmen who understood that survival in combat required more than technical skill. It required the wisdom to know when the maps were wrong, when the briefings were inadequate, when instinct mattered more than procedure. And it required the courage to trust that wisdom, even when doing so, meant breaking every rule in the book. The red cross-hatched areas on Halloway's chart, marking the flak positions that killed 60 bombers on Black Thursday, remain a testament to the disconnect between planning and reality. Intelligence officers who'd never flown through a flak barrage had marked those positions with clinical precision, had calculated the safest approach routes, had designed a mission profile that looked perfect on paper. But paper doesn't scream when shrapnel tears through it. Maps don't feel fear when the flak bursts start walking toward your formation. And procedures don't make life or death decisions when you're 21,000 feet over Germany, with enemy guns tracking your every move. Robert Halloway made that decision with incomplete information, inadequate training, and overwhelming fear. He made it wrong. By every measure of military discipline and professional competence, he lied to his pilot, falsified his position reports, and took his squadron off the assigned course. And in doing so, he demonstrated a truth that military institutions have always struggled to acknowledge. Sometimes the right action looks exactly like the wrong action until after it's over. and you can count the bodies that aren't there. The 80 Flak batteries defending Schweinfurt fired approximately 3,000 shells on October the 13th, 1943. Each shell was fused to explode at a specific altitude, each burst designed to send steel fragments screaming through a precisely calculated volume of sky. The German gunners had months of practice, sophisticated fire control equipment, and the advantage of knowing exactly where American bombers would approach from. Those gunners killed 600 men that day, but they didn't kill Robert Halloway and his crew, because 15 miles south of Schweinfurt, a young lieutenant who'd barely passed his navigation training had made an error in his star sights, had compounded that error with deliberate lies, and had saved 36 lives through a combination of fear, instinct, and dumb luck. The history books remember Black Thursday as one of the darkest days of the air war over Europe. They document the strategic failures, the intelligence lapses, the tactical errors that led to such catastrophic losses. They analyze what went wrong with clinical precision, reducing human tragedy to data points and lessons learned. But they don't talk about the one navigator who got it right by getting it wrong, who survived by disobeying, who saved lives by lying. Because that's not the kind of lesson military institutions can teach. It's too subjective, too dependent on individual judgment, too dangerous to codify into doctrine. Some truths can only be learned through experience, written in the space between official orders and actual survival, understood by the men who flew the missions and kept the secrets. Robert Halloway kept his secret for 43 years. When he finally told his daughter about what happened over Germany in 1943, he was 70 years old, dying of cancer, trying to explain something he'd never fully understood himself. "I was so scared," he told her, "every mission, every time we crossed into German airspace. But that day was different. I knew those flak positions were waiting, knew what they'd do to us, and when my navigation showed us off course, when I realized we'd accidentally avoided the worst of it, I just couldn't bring myself to correct back into that fire." "You saved lives," his daughter said. "I got lucky, there's a difference." He paused, struggling for breath, his navigator's precision with words failing him at the end. "Sometimes I think about all the men who followed orders that day. Good men. Better pilots than Richardson, better navigators than me. They did everything right, everything by the book, and they died for it. And you did everything wrong and lived." "Yes, and I've never been sure which lesson that's supposed to teach." That was the final paradox of Robert Halloway's war. He'd been trained, made to believe that precision and accuracy and following procedures would keep him alive. He'd spent 8 months learning to calculate positions within miles, to verify his navigation with multiple sources, to trust his instruments and his training and his orders. And then, in one critical moment, all of that training had told him to fly straight into the guns that killed 60 bombers. His error, his fear, his disobedience had saved him when precision would have killed him. Military institutions cannot build doctrine around such lessons. You cannot train navigators to make deliberate errors, cannot write procedures that say, disobey orders when it feels right, cannot create a system that rewards lying to your pilot. The machine of war requires predictability, standardization, chains of command that function under stress. But the reality of combat, the actual experience of men fighting for survival, often contradicts that institutional need for predictability. Sometimes the machine produces results that require human judgment to override, require individuals to look at the carefully planned mission and say, "This is wrong," even when they can't fully articulate why. Robert Halloway was one of thousands of navigators who served in the 8th Air Force during World War II. His contribution to the war effort was statistically insignificant. One squadron saved out of hundreds that flew, 36 lives preserved out of hundreds of thousands who served. The strategic bombing campaign continued with or without him, driven by industrial production and technological innovation and the grinding arithmetic of attrition warfare. But For those 36 men, for the families who welcomed them home, in 1945, instead of receiving telegrams that began, "We regret to inform you," for the children and grandchildren who exist because one navigator made a mistake at exactly the right time, the significance was absolute. Sometimes, history turns on great battles and strategic decisions made by generals and presidents. And sometimes it turns on a 22-year-old lieutenant who miscalculated a star site, lied about his position, and trusted his gut over his orders. The mathematics of war may be brutal and unforgiving, but the mathematics of survival often requires variables that cannot be quantified: instinct, luck, the wisdom to know when the plan is wrong, even if you can't prove it. Robert Halloway understood this truth in a way that most people never have to. He carried it with him for 43 years, never quite sure whether what he'd done was heroism or cowardice, never quite able to reconcile his successful survival with his catastrophic failure to follow orders. The red cross-hatched areas on his navigation chart remain, faded now, preserved in museum storage. They mark the positions where 80 German Flak batteries waited on October 13th, 1943, where 600 American airmen died following carefully planned approach routes, where the machinery of strategic warfare collided with human judgment and left questions that no amount of historical analysis can fully answer. Was Halloway right to disobey orders? Would more lives have been saved if other navigators had made similar decisions? Should military doctrine incorporate the kind of tactical flexibility that his actions represented? Or was he simply lucky, a statistical anomaly who survived despite his mistakes, rather than because of them? The only certain answer is that 36 men came home alive because their navigator couldn't bring himself to correct course toward the guns. Everything else is speculation, analysis, the endless attempt to extract lessons from chaos and impose order on events that defied prediction at the time and resist easy explanation decades later. That is the legacy of Robert Halloway's era. Not a lesson that can be taught, not tactic that can be replicated, but a reminder that the space between orders and survival is sometimes navigated by instinct rather than instruments, by fear rather than courage, by mistakes that only look like genius after the bodies are counted and the survivors tell their stories. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.